Henry Louis was a man who had everything, or so the world believed. At 42, he had built an empire that stretched across industries, a sprawling fortune that afforded him luxuries most could only dream of. Yet, standing in the middle of his penthouse apartment, surrounded by glass walls that framed a glittering city below, he felt the cold emptiness that no amount of wealth could fill. The heirloom cigar in his hand burned slowly, its smoke curling like ghosts in the dim light. He stared at the portrait of his late father hanging over the marble fireplace, a man of stature and vision whose legacy now rested on Henry's shoulders. There was no one to pass it on to. The thought gnawed at him. Marriage had been a futile endeavor, tried twice and failed twice. Love, he concluded, was nothing but a transaction doomed to unravel. But a child? A child was different. A child was an extension of himself, a vessel to carry forward his empire. Yet for a man like Henry, traditional means were riddled with complications he had no patience for. He needed a solution, one as calculated and controlled as every business deal he had ever struck. The next morning, his mind resolute, Henry found himself cruising through the city in his sleek black sports car. The urban chaos outside barely registered. His thoughts churned, crafting the perfect plan. A woman with no ties, no demands, just a woman to bear his hair. As he turned a corner near the downtown district, his eyes caught a peculiar sight. On the grimy sidewalk sat a young woman, hunched over a piece of paper, sketching furiously. Her hair, a tangled mess of brown, obscured part of her face, but her eyes, blue and fierce, shone with an intensity that seemed to defy her surroundings. Something about her struck him. The stark contrast between her delicate movements and the harsh reality around her was unsettling. Yet as the light turned green, he shook off the thought and sped away. But he couldn't get her out of his mind. A block later, he pulled into an empty parking lot and stared at the steering wheel. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. Yet the nagging pull of his instincts pushed him back. When he returned, she was still there, leaning the paper against the wall, her pencil moving with quiet precision. Henry pulled up to the curb and lowered the window. His voice cut through the noise of the street, cold and commanding. "You. Come here." She looked up, startled, her brows knitting in suspicion. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone sharp, her thin frame betraying weeks of hardship. "I want to talk," he replied, ignoring her guarded demeanor. "Get in the car." Her laughter was dry, almost bitter. "I'm not that kind of girl," she snapped. "Neither am I that kind of man," he shot back, his patience fraying. "You can either keep drawing on this filthy street or come with me and hear something that might change your life." The weight of his words hung in the air. She hesitated, eyes darting between him and her battered sketchpad. Finally, she stood, gathering her things, and climbed into the car. The silence between them was heavy as he drove to a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. Inside, seated across from him at a corner table, she finally spoke. "What's this about?" "What's your name?" he asked, ignoring her question. "Lila," she replied, folding her arms defensively. "And you?" "Henry Louis," he said, leaning forward. "And I have a proposition for you." Her eyes narrowed, wary. "What kind of proposition?" He took a deep breath. "I want you to have my child." The color drained from her face as the words hit her. For a moment she was speechless, staring at him as though he had spoken in a foreign language. Then she laughed, short, sharp, and incredulous. "You're insane," she said, pushing her chair back as if to leave. "Wait," Henry said, his voice firm. "Hear me out. I'll cover all your expenses during the pregnancy. When the child is born, you'll be free to go, with a financial settlement that will set you up for life. No strings attached." Lila stared at him, her mind racing. Was this a cruel joke? Yet the steel in his eyes told her he was serious. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice trembling with equal parts anger and fear. Henry leaned back, his expression unchanging. "Then you walk out of here, back to that sidewalk, and I'll find someone else." The words stung more than she wanted to admit. She didn't trust him, couldn't trust him, but the allure of stability, of escape, was undeniable. Layla stood abruptly, clutching her sketchpad. "I need time to think." "You have 24 hours, Henry said as she walked away, his voice echoing in the cafe. "After that, the offer expires." As she stepped into the cold night, Layla's heart pounded. What kind of man makes such an offer to a stranger? And why her? The questions swirled in her mind unanswered. Little did she know, this was only the beginning. Layla finds a crumpled note in her coat pocket as she walks home. It wasn't there before. Written in bold letters, it reads, "You don't know who he really is. Don't trust him." Layla walked through the dimly lit streets, clutching her sketchpad as if it were a lifeline. The cafe encounter replayed in her mind, each word from Henry sharp and precise, cutting through her already fragile resolve. The absurdity of his proposal warred with the desperation of her reality. Rain began to drizzle, soaking her thin coat. She pulled it tighter, teeth chattering, as she hurried toward the makeshift shelter she'd found under an abandoned building's overhang. Tonight, like so many others, she would sleep on the cold concrete floor with her sketchpad as her only comfort. But as she reached into her coat pocket to find a piece of bread she had saved from earlier, her fingers brushed against something unexpected. A piece of paper. Her heart skipped a beat as she unfolded it. In bold, uneven handwriting, it read, "You don't know who he really is. Don't trust him." Her breath hitched, and she looked around, but the street was deserted, the rain masking any sounds of footsteps. She turned the note over, but there was nothing else, no signature, no hint of who had written it. She sank to the ground, the dampness seeping into her clothes, and stared at the words. Who could have left it? And why? Meanwhile, in his sprawling penthouse, Henry stared out at the city, his mind restless. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, swirling the amber liquid as the rain drummed against the glass windows. The deal was perfect, meticulously planned. He had spent years avoiding emotional entanglements, and this arrangement would be no different. Yet something about Layla had unsettled him. She wasn't like the women in his world, polished, predictable, and eager to please. Her defiance intrigued him, but it also irritated him. He needed her compliance, not her attitude. As he took a sip, his phone buzzed on the counter. Picking it up, he saw a message from an unknown number. "You've made your move, Henry, but she's not who you think she is." His grip tightened around the glass. This was no coincidence. Someone was watching, and that someone knew more about Layla than he did. The next morning, Layla awoke with stiff limbs and an aching back. The note was still clutched in her hand, its ominous message burned into her mind. She tried to focus on her drawing, but her thoughts kept drifting to Henry and his proposition. She thought about the child he wanted, how clinical and cold his approach was. But she also thought about his eyes, the way they had softened for a fleeting moment when he said the word heir. Was there more to him than the ruthless businessman he projected? But then there was the note. Don't trust him. She had to know more. She decided to go back to the cafe, hoping to find some clarity. As she walked, her mind raced with questions. Who was Henry Lewis, really? And why had she been chosen for such an absurd deal? At the cafe, she lingered near the entrance, unsure of what she was even looking for. She was about to leave when a man approached her. He was scruffy, with a long coat and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. "You're the one he talked to yesterday, aren't you?" he said in a hushed voice. Layla's stomach twisted. "Who are you?" "Just someone who knows more about Henry Lewis than you ever will," he replied, glancing around nervously. "You need to be careful. He's dangerous." Her pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting to the street. "I can't say much. But if you go through with this, you'll regret it. Trust me." Before she could ask anything else, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving her with more questions than answers. Lila returned to her shelter that night, her mind a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty. As she settled down, she noticed a black car idling across the street, its headlights off, but the silhouette of a driver unmistakable. Her heart pounded as she watched the car for what felt like hours. When she finally mustered the courage to look again, it was gone. And in its place, on the ground where the car had been parked, lay another note. "Make your choice, but remember, there's no going back." Layla sat on the edge of the abandoned building's overhang, the second note clutched tightly in her hand. The words were etched into her mind. "Make your choice, but remember, there's no going back." The weight of her situation pressed on her chest. Who was behind these notes? Why was she being warned against Henry? And what was the cost of ignoring these cryptic messages? Her thoughts spiraled until she couldn't sit still anymore. She needed answers. She needed to know who Henry really was and why this stranger believed he was dangerous. Across town, Henry was deep in thought. His office was a fortress of glass and steel, but the message on his phone from the previous night had left a crack in his calculated composure. "Run a full background check on Lila Parker," he barked into his phone, addressing his personal investigator. "I want everything. Her history, her connections, even her blood type." He hung up, staring out over the city skyline. Henry prided himself on being a man who always had the upper hand. But this time he felt something slipping through his fingers. Who was Lila? Why had she been the one to draw his attention so strongly? And more importantly, who was trying to warn her off? Layla decided she couldn't wait for the truth to find her. She had to dig for it herself. The next morning she made her way back to the cafe where she had first met Henry. This time her goal was clear: find someone who knew him. She sat quietly at a corner table, scanning the room. The staff bustled around, but she noticed a middle-aged woman working behind the counter, her uniform crisp and her demeanor focused. Leila hesitated, then approached. "Excuse me," she began, her voice wavering slightly. "Do you know Henry Lewis? He comes here often." The woman froze for a fraction of a second, a reaction so brief that most wouldn't notice. But Leila did. "Why do you ask?" The woman replied, her tone cautious. Layla leaned in, lowering her voice. "He made me an offer. A strange one. I need to know more about him." The woman sighed, glancing around before speaking. "Henry Lewis is complicated. I've worked here for years, and he's been a regular since the beginning. Always polite, always generous with tips, but there's something about him. He's calculating, cold. Like everything in his life is a chess game, and we're all just pieces." Layla frowned. "Has he ever done anything strange?" The woman hesitated, then shook her head. "Not that I've seen. But people like him, they don't show their true colors to just anyone." Layla thanked her and returned to her seat, the woman's words adding to the growing cloud of uncertainty around Henry. That evening, as Layla wandered the streets, she noticed a figure trailing her at a distance. Panic rose in her chest, but instead of running, she ducked into an alley and waited. When the figure passed, she stepped out behind them. "Why are you following me?" she demanded. The man turned, startled. It was the same scruffy man from the cafe. "I told you to be careful," he said, his voice low. "Henry Lewis isn't who you think he is." Layla crossed her arms, her frustration bubbling over. "Then who is he? Stop talking in riddles." The man glanced around nervously, as if expecting someone to leap out of the shadows. "Henry's not just a businessman. He's connected. He doesn't just make deals. He makes people disappear when they get in his way." Layla's stomach turned. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're in over your head," the man replied. "You think you're just a pawn in his game, but you're more important than you realize. And if you go through with his plan, it won't end the way you think." Layla's resolve was shaken, but she couldn't stop now. She needed to confront Henry, to hear the truth from him directly. The next morning, she marched into his office building, her heart pounding as she approached the receptionist. "I need to see Mr. Lewis," she said firmly. The receptionist gave her a skeptical look, but made a call. Moments later, a tall man in a black suit appeared, his expression unreadable. "Follow me," he said curtly. As she stepped into the elevator, her chest tightened. This was it. The moment she would demand answers. But as the elevator doors closed, the man leaned in and whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." The doors opened to a darkened hallway, and Leila froze. The man gestured for her to step out, but her instincts screamed at her to run. And then she saw him, Henry, standing at the end of the hallway, his face unreadable, his presence commanding. "Leila," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." Leila stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway, her breath caught in her chest. The man who had whispered the ominous warning stepped back into the elevator, leaving her alone with Henry. The sound of the elevator doors closing echoed ominously in the silence. Henry's presence at the end of the hallway was commanding, almost predatory. His sharp suit seemed to reflect the same calculated precision he carried in every move. "Leila," he said again, this time softer, almost inviting. "Come in." Leila hesitated but forced her feet to move forward. The heavy door to Henry's office swung open, revealing a space as imposing as the man himself. Sleek black furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and a single desk devoid of clutter. Henry gestured to a chair in front of his desk. "Sit," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. She sat down slowly, clutching her bag like a lifeline. "I need answers," she began, trying to steady her voice. "And you'll get them," Henry replied, sitting across from her. His gaze was piercing, almost hypnotic. "But first, I want to know something. Who's been talking to you?" Leila's eyes widened. "What?" "Don't play coy," he said, leaning forward. "Someone has been feeding you doubts, hasn't they? A man, perhaps? Ragged appearance, follows you around like a shadow?" Her silence was answer enough. Henry's lips curled into a cold smile. "I thought so." Leila gathered her courage. "Who is he? Why is he warning me about you?" Henry leaned back, his expression unreadable. "He's an opportunist, a man who sees an opening and tries to exploit it. Whatever he told you, it's designed to manipulate you, not protect you." "But why?" Leila pressed. "Why would he care about me?" "Because you're valuable," Henry said simply. "You're part of something bigger than you realize, and there are people out there who will do anything to disrupt it." Leila frowned. "You're talking in circles. What bigger thing are you talking about?" Henry's smile faded. He reached into a drawer, pulling out a thick folder. "Everything you need to know is here," he said, sliding it across the desk. "But understand this, if you open that folder, there's no going back. You'll be stepping into a world where trust is a rare commodity and the stakes are costly." Leila hesitated before opening the folder. Inside she found pages of legal documents, photographs, and handwritten notes. Her eyes scanned the first page and her stomach churned. There were photographs of her, sitting on the sidewalk, drawing, walking through the city. But what shocked her most was a photo of her as a child, standing next to a woman she barely remembered. Her mother. How did you get these?" she stammered, her voice shaking. Henry's gaze softened slightly. "Your mother and I knew each other. A long time ago. She trusted me." Leila's heart raced. "What are you saying? You knew my mother?" "Yes," Henry admitted. "And when she passed, I made a promise to protect you. That's why I found you, Leila. You were never just a random stranger." Leila's mind spun with questions. If Henry had known her mother, why had he waited so long to find her? And why approach her with such a cold, calculated offer? "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Because I needed you to make your decision without bias," Henry said calmly. "If you agreed to my offer out of obligation or guilt, it wouldn't work. I needed you to choose for yourself." Layla shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. This is insane. My life has been a mess for years, and now you're telling me you've been watching from the sidelines. That you could have helped me but didn't. Henry's expression darkened. It's not that simple. If I had intervened earlier, you would have become a target. The people who are after me would have turned their attention to you. I kept my distance to keep you safe. Before Layla could respond, the door to the office burst open. 2 men in suits entered, their faces grim. Mr. Lewis, one of them said urgently, we have a situation. Someone breached the security perimeter. Henry's jaw tightened. Who? We're not sure yet, the man replied, but we believe it's the same individual who's been following Miss Parker. Layla's heart leaped into her throat. What? He's here. Henry stood, his demeanor shifting into something colder, more dangerous. Stay here, he ordered, heading toward the door. No, Layla shouted, standing as well. If he's here, I want to know why. Henry paused, turning to look at her. For the first time, there was a flicker of something human in his eyes. Layla, you don't understand what's at stake. Then explain it to me, she demanded. Before Henry could respond, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the hallway. Layla and Henry turned toward the noise, their expressions mirroring the same mix of fear and urgency. Stay behind me, Henry said, his voice firm. But Layla wasn't about to be sidelined. Whoever this stranger was, she needed answers, and she was determined to get them, no matter the cost. Layla's heart pounded as she followed Henry into the hallway, her footsteps hesitant but determined. The distant sound of breaking glass had sent a shiver down her spine, but the questions in her mind drowned out her fear. She had to know the truth, about Henry, about the stranger, and about herself. The hallway stretched before them like a tunnel of uncertainty, dimly lit and eerily quiet. Henry moved with purpose, his sharp gaze scanning every corner. Behind him, Layla struggled to keep up, her mind racing with possibilities. Stay close, Henry said without turning. Not a chance, Layla shot back. I want answers, Henry. No more secrets. Henry didn't reply. Instead, he stopped abruptly at a corner and pressed his back against the wall. He motioned for Layla to do the same, his expression serious. Whoever this is, he whispered, they've gone to great lengths to find you. That means they're dangerous. Before Layla could respond, a figure stepped into view at the far end of the hallway. It was the man who had whispered to her earlier, the same ragged figure who had warned her about Henry. Layla, the man called out, his voice echoing down the corridor. You're in danger. Come with me. Now. Henry stepped forward, his posture rigid, his voice sharp. Don't take another step. The man stopped, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. His appearance was even more disheveled up close. Clothes torn, eyes hollow, face lined with exhaustion. But his gaze was fixed on Layla, pleading and urgent. You don't know what he's done, the man said, pointing at Henry. He's lying to you, manipulating you, just like he did to her. To who? Layla demanded, stepping forward despite Henry's warning. The man hesitated, his expression softening. Your mother. The words hit Layla like a physical blow. She turned to Henry, her eyes wide with shock. What is he talking about? What did you do to my mother? Henry's face darkened, his usual composure cracking slightly. Don't listen to him. He's trying to twist the truth. But the man pressed on, his voice growing louder. Your mother trusted him, Layla. She thought he was her friend, her protector. But he betrayed her, and when she tried to escape, hey. Enough, Henry roared, his voice echoing through the hallway. The sudden outburst silenced them all. Henry took a deep breath, his hands clenched into fists. When he spoke again, his tone was calmer but laced with anger. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, his eyes locked on the man. Layla's mother made her own choices. I did what I could to help her, but she. He trailed off, his gaze shifting to the floor. Layla stepped forward, her voice trembling. What happened to her, Henry? Tell me the truth. Henry looked up, his expression conflicted. She got involved with the wrong people. She was in danger, Layla. I tried to save her, but she wouldn't listen. She thought she could handle it on her own, and she paid the price. Lies. The man shouted, his voice trembling with rage. You were the danger, Henry. You pulled her into your world, used her, and when she became a liability, you let her die. Layla's knees felt weak. Her gaze darted between Henry and the stranger, her mind struggling to make sense of the conflicting stories. Who do I believe? She whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. The man took a step closer, his hands still raised. Layla, listen to me. You're not safe with him. He's already lied to you, manipulated you. If you stay, you'll end up just like your mother. Henry stepped forward as well, his voice firm. Don't be foolish, Layla. This man is playing on your emotions. He wants to turn you against me for his own gain. Why would I do that? The man retorted. I have nothing to gain. I'm risking my life to protect her. Then why break into my building? Henry shot back. Why not come to me directly, if your intentions are so noble? The man hesitated, his jaw tightening. Because I know what you're capable of, Henry, and I wasn't going to let you silence me before I could warn her. Layla took a step back, her head spinning. She felt like a pawn in a game she didn't understand, caught between two men who each claimed to have her best interests at heart. Enough, she said, her voice shaking. Both of you. I've had enough of your cryptic warnings and half-truths. If either of you wants me to trust you, you're going to have to prove it. The two men fell silent, their gazes locked in a tense standoff. How? Henry asked finally, his tone cautious. Layla crossed her arms, her eyes blazing. Take me to the place where it all began. To the truth about my mother. Show me what really happened and let me decide for myself. The stranger nodded immediately, his expression resolute. I'll take you there. Tonight. Henry hesitated, his jaw clenching. Fine, he said at last. But know this, once you step into that world, there's no going back. The three of them stood in the hallway, the tension between them almost unbearable. Somewhere in the shadows, the truth awaited, along with the danger that came with it. Would Layla finally uncover the answers she sought? Or was she walking straight into a trap? Layla sat in the backseat of the stranger's old, beaten car, her heart pounding like a war drum. Henry had insisted on following in his own car, his sleek black SUV trailing them like a silent predator. The streetlights blurred as they drove through the city, leaving behind the glittering towers of wealth and descending into the forgotten corners of the urban maze. The stranger who had finally introduced himself as Marcus glanced at her through the rearview mirror. His eyes, though tired, held a glimmer of determination. You'll understand everything soon, Marcus said, his voice steady but low. But you need to be ready for what you'll see. The truth isn't pretty. Layla's grip on her seatbelt tightened. Why do you care so much? Why risk everything for me? Marcus didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened and for a moment she thought he might ignore her. Then he sighed. Because your mother once saved my life, he admitted, and I couldn't save hers. But maybe I can save you. The car slowed as they reached an abandoned industrial area. Cracked asphalt and rusting machinery surrounded them, shrouded in darkness. The air was thick with the scent of oil and decay, the remnants of a life long past. Henry's SUV pulled up behind them, its headlights slicing through the gloom. As they stepped out of their vehicles, the tension was palpable. Henry's presence loomed, his sharp suit out of place in the desolate setting. What is this place? Layla asked, her voice echoing in the stillness. This is where it all began, Marcus said, gesturing toward a crumbling warehouse. Where your mother's story ended, and where yours might begin. Henry scoffed, his arms crossed. Dramatic as ever, Marcus. But this is nothing more than a dead end. The trio entered the warehouse, a creak of the rusted doors breaking the eerie silence. The inside was cold and damp, illuminated only by the faint moonlight streaming through shattered windows. Marcus led them to a far corner, where the faint outline of an old desk and filing cabinets remained. He pulled out a flashlight from his pocket, the beam cutting through the darkness as he searched. "What are you looking for?" Henry demanded, his voice tense. "The proof," Marcus replied without looking up. He finally stopped at a hidden compartment in the wall. With a grunt, he forced it open, revealing a small locked box. He handed it to Leela. "This," Marcus said, "contains everything your mother wanted you to know." Leila's hands trembled as she took the box. She glanced at Henry, whose expression was unreadable. "What's in it?" she whispered. Marcus hesitated. Her journal. Her truth. But also, evidence of what Henry did to her. Henry stepped forward, his voice cold and commanding. "Don't listen to him, Leila. He's twisting the story. Whatever's in there, it's been planted to make me look like the villain." Marcus laughed bitterly. "Of course you'd say that. You've been lying to her from the start." Leila backed away from both of them, clutching the box tightly. "Enough," she yelled, her voice echoing through the empty space. "I'm sick of your accusations and your cryptic comments. I just want the truth. No more games." Both men fell silent, their gazes locked in a battle of wills. "Fine," Leila said, her voice steadier. "I'll open it and decide for myself." She sat down on the cold, dusty floor and fumbled with the lock. Marcus handed her a small key, his hands shaking slightly. With a click, the box opened, revealing a worn leather journal, photographs, and a stack of documents. Leila opened the journal first. Her mother's handwriting greeted her, the ink faded but legible. "If you're reading this, my sweet Leila, it means I didn't make it. But you deserve to know the truth. About me, about Henry, and about the price of his promises." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She flipped through the pages, her mother's voice speaking to her from beyond the grave. The entries painted a picture of a woman trapped, manipulated, and ultimately betrayed by a man she once trusted. Photographs showed her mother, younger and happier, but gradually the light in her eyes faded. The last photo was of her holding a newborn Leila, her expression a mixture of joy and despair. Leila turned to the documents. They were contracts signed by her mother and Henry, detailing an agreement chillingly similar to the one Henry had proposed to her, promises of security and wealth in exchange for complete control. But there was something else: termination clauses, penalties, and legal threats that painted Henry as a man willing to do anything to protect his interests. Marcus knelt beside her, his voice soft. She tried to escape, Leila. She realized too late what she had signed up for, and when she tried to break free, she died. Leila finished, her voice hollow. Henry took a step forward, his expression hard. "She died because she made reckless choices, Leila. Choices I couldn't protect her from. Don't let Marcus rewrite history." Leila stood, clutching the journal and documents to her chest. Her tears had dried, replaced by a steely determination. "I've heard enough," she said, her voice steady. Marcus and Henry both looked at her, waiting for her next move. "What happens next," she continued, "is up to me, and I won't let either of you decide my fate." The warehouse seemed to hold its breath as Leila walked toward the exit, leaving both men behind in the shadows. Leila had found the truth, or at least part of it. But with Henry's lies and Marcus's warnings still ringing in her ears, she realized her journey was far from over. The next steps would be hers alone, and the stakes had never been higher. Leila stood outside the warehouse, the weight of her mother's journal and the documents pressing against her chest. The night air was cold, biting through her thin coat, but it was nothing compared to the chill running through her veins. Revelations inside that small box had shattered every ounce of trust she tried to build. Behind her, Marcus and Henry lingered in the shadows, their animosity palpable. Both men claimed to have her best interests at heart, yet both had proven to be liars in their own ways. "Leila," Marcus called out, his voice softer now. "You can't face him alone. Let me help you." Henry stepped forward, his tone calculated and calm. "Or you can walk away from this mess entirely. Take my offer and you'll never have to deal with this again. Leila had made up her mind. She wouldn't be anyone's pawn. Not anymore. She turned to Marcus. If I let you help me, you have to tell me everything. No more half-truths, no more vague warnings. I want the full story, about my mother, about Henry, about all of it. Marcus hesitated, glancing at Henry, who stood silent but menacing. Finally, he nodded. You deserve to know everything. Henry smirked, his confidence unshaken. Do as you like, Leila. Just remember, truths are easy to twist, especially by those who have something to gain. Ignoring him, Leila climbed into Marcus's car. The engine roared to life and they drove off, leaving Henry standing alone under the flickering streetlights. As they drove through the dark streets, Marcus began to speak, his voice heavy with emotion. Your mother, Evelyn, was one of the brightest, kindest people I ever met, he said. But she was also desperate. When Henry found her, she thought he was her salvation. She thought she could trust him. Leila clutched the journal tighter. What happened? Marcus sighed. He promised her stability, a new life. But his promises always came with strings attached. She didn't realize until it was too late that he wasn't looking for a partner. He was looking for someone he could control. Leila's jaw tightened. And you? Where were you in all of this? I was complicit in the beginning, Marcus admitted, his voice tinged with shame. I worked for Henry. I believed in his vision. But when I saw what he was doing to your mother, how he manipulated her, isolated her, I couldn't stay silent. Why didn't you stop him? Leila's voice cracked, a mix of anger and despair. I tried, Marcus said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. But Henry is powerful. By the time I realized the full extent of his plans, it was too late. Evelyn was already trapped. They pulled into a quiet alley, away from prying eyes. Marcus parked the car and turned to face her. There's something else you need to know, he said. Your mother, she didn't die in an accident, Leila. She was killed. Leila felt as though the air had been sucked out of the car. What are you talking about? Marcus's expression was grim. She tried to leave him. She wanted to take you and disappear, start over somewhere far away, but Henry couldn't let that happen. You were his heir, his investment, and Evelyn. She knew too much. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, each one more horrifying than the last. You're saying he had her murdered? Leila whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus nodded. I don't have proof, but I know Henry. He doesn't let anything, or anyone, jeopardize his plans. Before Leila could respond, the roar of an engine echoed down the alley. Headlights blinded them as a car sped toward them, screeching to a halt. Henry stepped out, his face shadowed but his presence unmistakable. I warned you, Marcus, he said, his voice dangerously calm. You should have stayed out of this. Marcus pushed Leila behind him. Stay back, Henry. She knows the truth now. You can't control her anymore. Henry chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. You think I'm here to argue. I'm here to end this nonsense. Leila's heart raced as she realized the full extent of Henry's threat. This wasn't a man who would simply walk away. Henry advanced toward them, his movements slow and deliberate. Marcus reached into his jacket, pulling out a small pistol. Stay where you are, he warned. Henry stopped, his hands raised mockingly. Do you really think you can protect her, Marcus? You couldn't protect Evelyn. What makes you think this will be any different? The tension was suffocating. Leila felt trapped, her options narrowing with every second. She glanced at the documents in her lap, the key to exposing Henry's crimes. Leila, Marcus said without looking at her, run, now. I'm not leaving you, she protested. You have to, he insisted. Get those documents to someone who can use them. They're the only chance we have. Reluctantly, Leila grabbed the documents and scrambled out of the car. She sprinted into the night, her footsteps echoing in the empty streets. Behind her she heard the sounds of a struggle, Shouts, a gunshot, and then silence. She didn't look back. As she ran, her mind raced. She had uncovered the truth, but at what cost? And with Henry still determined to silence her, she realized her fight was far from over. Layla ran through the dark alleys, her breath coming in short gasps, her heart pounding against her ribs. She could hear Henry's footsteps behind her, gaining speed, closing in. The chill of the night air seemed to seep into her bones as she pushed herself harder, the documents clutched tightly to her chest. As she turned a corner, Layla stumbled, nearly tripping over a loose brick in the road. She barely managed to regain her footing, her pulse quickening. What if she couldn't escape? What if Henry caught her? Layla, stop running. Henry's voice echoed in the darkness. You can't keep this up forever. But Layla didn't stop. She had come too far, learned too much, to let fear paralyze her now. Her mind raced through the options. Run harder, find a safe place to hide, or risk it all and confront Henry. Layla rounded another corner and found herself at a dead end, the brick wall rising high before her. Henry was getting closer. She could hear him just behind the wall, his footsteps steady and sure. She had no choice but to turn and face him. Layla, come out, Henry called, his tone a mixture of calm and command. It doesn't have to be like this. You're only making things worse for yourself. Breathing heavily, Layla stepped away from the wall, her hands trembling. What do you want from me, Henry? Henry emerged from the shadows, his eyes cold and calculating. I want you to make the right choice, Layla. I've given you a way out. Accept the deal, and this will all be over. Layla's grip on the documents tightened. What deal? A child for my freedom. Is that really what you think my life is worth? Isn't it? Henry countered, taking a step closer. Think about it. You're alone, with nothing. This is your chance to start over, without having to look over your shoulder. Layla's eyes filled with tears. But she fought them back. And what happens after the baby is born? What happens when you get what you want and then get bored? Henry hesitated, then let out a long, slow breath. After the baby is born, I'll give you the money and the means to disappear, far away from here. But you'll be alone, Layla. No one to rely on, no one to hold you accountable. It's what you wanted, isn't it? Layla shook her head, her voice breaking. That's not living, Henry. That's existing, and I'm not willing to do that anymore. Henry stepped closer, his voice softer now, almost pleading. You don't understand, Layla. This is your only chance. You're running out of time. No, Layla said, her resolve firming. I'm done with your games, Henry. You think I'll fall for your manipulation again? Not this time. Henry's expression darkened and he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small black envelope. Then maybe this will change your mind. He held the envelope out to her, his eyes locking with hers. Inside is a photo of your mother, Layla, on the night she died. Layla's breath caught in her throat. What are you talking about? Henry took another step forward, his voice low and intense. I know what happened to her, Layla, and if you don't accept my offer, if you keep digging, I'll make sure everyone knows the truth. About your mother, about you, about everything. Layla felt the ground beneath her feet give way. The photo could be a fake, a trick. Yet there was something about the way Henry held it, something in his eyes that told her he wasn't lying. What do you want from me, Henry? She'd asked again, her voice barely a whisper. Your silence, Henry replied, his gaze unflinching. And if you're not willing to give it, then I'll have to silence you myself. Layla's mind was racing, her options narrowing. The photo in Henry's hand was a game changer, a threat she couldn't ignore. But if she accepted his offer, she'd be walking into his trap, a trap that had already claimed her mother. Layla, please, Marcus's voice broke through the night, his footsteps approaching from behind. Don't listen to him. We can go to the police, we can. No, Layla interrupted, her resolve hardening. No more running, Marcus. No more hiding. It ends here. Henry's eyes gleamed as he watched the confrontation unfold. Make your choice, Layla. The clock is ticking. Layla turned to Marcus, her heart breaking for the man who had tried to protect her. Take the photo, Marcus. Use it, if you have to, but I'm not walking into that deal. Marcus hesitated, his eyes full of regret. Layla, don't do this. I have to, she said softly, her voice steady. For my mother, for me, for everything. With a deep breath, Layla took a step toward Henry, her eyes steady. I'm done being afraid, Henry. Do what you will, but I'm done. Henry watched her for a long moment, then slowly lowered the envelope, his shoulders slumping. You're making a mistake, Layla. But it's your choice. Not anymore, she replied, her heart heavy but her resolve unshaken. It's my life and I'm not letting you control it. As she turned and walked away, Henry's voice followed her, soft and chilling. You'll regret this, Layla. One way or another, you'll regret it. Layla walked through the city streets, the weight of the world on her shoulders. Every step felt heavy, as if the city itself was closing in around her. She could still hear Henry's voice echoing in her mind, his threats, his promises. Her mother's face, the photo Marcus had shown her, was burned into her memory, taunting her with the knowledge that one wrong move could end in disaster. She walked for hours, lost in her thoughts, until she found herself standing outside a small, quiet park. The streetlights cast a dim glow over the playground, the swings gently swaying in the breeze. It was the first time in a long while that Layla felt a moment of peace, a brief respite from the turmoil in her life. Layla, a voice called from behind her, and she turned to find Marcus jogging up to her. His face was drawn with concern, his eyes searching hers. You've been running all night. Where are you going? Layla shook her head, her fingers curling around the handle of her bag. I don't know, Marcus. I don't know what to do. Marcus reached for her hand, his touch warm and grounding. You've got to stay with me on this, Layla. We can find a way together. She met his gaze, the emotions swirling within her. What if there's no way out, Marcus? What if he's right? Marcus's expression was determined, his voice steady. Then we make our own way. We won't let him control us. Layla looked away, trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to spill over. But I don't know if I can do it, Marcus. What if it's too much? Marcus took a step closer, his eyes gentle but resolute. We'll figure it out, Layla. Whatever it takes, we'll find a way. Layla's fingers tightened around Marcus's hand, seeking comfort in his presence. But what if I make the wrong choice? What if I can't protect myself? Marcus lifted her chin with a finger, forcing her to meet his eyes. Layla, you're not alone in this. You've got people who care about you, who will stand by you, no matter what. She let out a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. It doesn't feel like enough. Sometimes it's all you need, Marcus said softly. Just enough to take the next step. They stood there for a moment, the city's quiet around them, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside Layla's mind. Finally, she nodded, the decision clear in her eyes. I need to find my mother's killer, Marcus. I need to know what really happened. Marcus's grip on her hand tightened. Then let's do it together. Whatever it takes, Layla. Together, they walked into the park, ready to face whatever lay ahead. As they sat on a park bench, surrounded by the whispers of the leaves in the wind, Layla took a deep breath. I know what I have to do now, Marcus. But it's not going to be easy. Marcus leaned closer, his voice steady. Nothing worthwhile ever is. But we're not alone, Layla. We've got each other. Layla looked out at the playground, the swings that still moved despite the darkness. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think I might be ready. Ready to face him? Marcus asked gently. Layla nodded, her eyes meeting his. Yes, ready to face whatever it takes. They sat in silence for a moment longer, absorbing the weight of their decision. Then Marcus leaned in and kissed her forehead, his touch a promise of support. We're in this together, he said, his voice steady and unwavering. Lila smiled, a small, bitter twist of hope in her eyes. Together, no matter what. As they made their way back through the city, Layla's mind was clear, her resolve stronger than ever. She knew that the final confrontation with Henry was inevitable, and now, more than ever, she was prepared to face it. Henry's penthouse was just as opulent as she remembered. Marble floors, priceless artwork, and a breathtaking view of the city lights. But there was no comfort in these surroundings for Layla. This was where her mother's story had ended, where Henry's grip on her life had begun. Henry was waiting for her when they arrived, his expression unreadable as he opened the door. "Layla," he said, his tone almost casual. "I was wondering when you'd show up." She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm done running, Henry. No more games." Henry stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. "Then let's finish this." As Layla stepped into the penthouse, she knew that the only way out was through. This was the final chapter in her story, the one where she would either win her freedom or lose it all. Layla stood at the entrance of Henry's penthouse, her heart pounding with every beat. The sleek, polished floors seemed to reflect her fear and determination, her past and future colliding in this moment. This was it. The end of the line. The final chapter where everything would be decided. Henry stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his hands clasped behind his back, a silent observer of the city below. "I thought you might change your mind," he said, not looking back at her. Layla took a step forward, her voice steady despite the quiver in her hands. "I didn't come here to change my mind, Henry. I came here to finish this." Henry finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "And what is it you're trying to finish, Layla?" "I want my mother's killer brought to justice," she replied, her voice unwavering. "I want to know why she was taken from me." Henry's eyes narrowed slightly, his lips curving into a slight smile. "And you think you can find that out through me?" Layla squared her shoulders, her gaze steady. "I think you know more than you're letting on, Henry. I think you're hiding something." Henry's eyes flickered, a flash of anger behind the calm facade. "You're not in any position to make demands, Layla." "Maybe not," she said, taking another step closer, "but I am in a position to find the truth." There was a long silence as Henry studied her, his gaze lingering on her face as if searching for something. "What do you want from me, Layla?" Layla took a deep breath, her voice steady. "I want to know the truth, Henry. I want to know why my mother was killed and why you've kept it from me." Henry's hands fell to his sides, his eyes still locked on hers. "You think I had something to do with it?" "I think you know something," she replied, her voice steady, "and I think it's time you told me." Henry's lips tightened, his jaw clenched. "You're mistaken, Layla." "Am I?" she challenged, her eyes narrowing. "Then why did you make me this offer? Why did you need me to have your child?" Henry hesitated for a moment, then looked away, his gaze shifting to the window. "Because it was convenient. Because I thought you wouldn't ask questions." "Convenient for you, maybe," Layla retorted, her voice sharp, "but not for me. And now I want answers." Henry turned back to face her, his expression cold. "And what makes you think you can handle the truth, Layla?" "Because I need to know," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I need to understand why everything was taken from me." For a moment, there was a battle behind Henry's eyes, a struggle between his calm exterior and the turmoil beneath. Then he sighed, looking defeated. "Fine," he said, his voice low. "I'll tell you everything." Layla's heart skipped a beat as he led her to a leather couch, gesturing for her to sit. "This is going to change everything, Henry. Are you ready for that?" He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "Yes, but it's not going to be easy for either of us." Layla took a seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Start from the beginning, Henry. Tell me everything." For the next few hours, Henry sat across from her, recounting his version of events. The business deals gone wrong, the pressure from his family, and the connections that led to her mother's death. It wasn't a confession, but it was close enough for Leila to understand why things had spiraled out of control. "So my mother was a casualty of your world," Leila said softly, her voice trembling. "She was caught in something bigger than she could handle." Henry nodded, his expression pained. "I never wanted this for you, Leila. I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," Leila said, her eyes filled with sadness and anger. "And now you're telling me the truth because you have no other choice." Henry reached out, placing a hand over hers. "Because it's the only way to end this. For both of us." Leila pulled her hand away, staring at the floor for a moment before looking back up at him. "And what happens now, Henry? What's my next step?" Henry hesitated, then looked away. "I don't know, Leila. I wish I could give you a clear answer, but this isn't a happy ending story. There's no neat resolution to this mess." Leila took a deep breath, standing up and facing him directly. "Then I'll make my own way out of it. I'll find my own path." Henry stood as well, his eyes locked on hers. "And what will you do with what you know?" "I'll decide who to trust," she said, her voice steady. "I'll decide who belongs in my life and who doesn't." Henry nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to the door. "I hope you find the answers you're looking for, Leila, and I hope you find peace." Leila turned away, walking toward the door without looking back. "I don't know if I can ever find peace," she said quietly, "but I'm done being afraid." Henry watched her go, his expression one of regret and resignation. As she stepped out into the night, a city's lights seemed to blur around her, and for the first time, Leila felt like she was truly free. Free to face whatever came next. As Leila walked away from the penthouse, she knew that her journey was far from over. The story of her mother's death was just the beginning of a new chapter where she would learn to trust again, where she would find her own strength and create a future that was hers alone. And with that knowledge, Leila stepped into the night, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The screen faded to black, and the comments section began to fill with reactions. Views and likes skyrocketing as viewers pondered the choices Leila had made, the fate that had been forced upon her, and the strength it took to break free.